Welcome back. Today I'm going to talk about Chapter 5, Sensation and Perception. There is a difference between the two. Sensation is when sensory organs, such as the retina in the eye, detect physical stimuli from the external world and transmit that information through the nervous system to the brain. Perception is the interpretation, the analysis of that information by the brain. Various parts of the cortex are specialized for the interpretation of different sensory modalities. For example, the occipital lobe in the back of the brain is specialized for the interpretation of visual information, while the temporal lobe is specialized for the interpretation of auditory or sound information. There are two important thresholds for the detection of sensory information. One is the absolute threshold, or the least amount of stimulus that the sensory organs can detect. The second is the difference threshold. How much of a difference in stimulus intensity must there be before we can notice it? This is sometimes called the just noticeable difference. This difference is defined by Weber's law, which states that the just noticeable difference between any two stimuli is proportional to the magnitude of the stimuli. Fortunately for us, our nervous system uses a process called sensory adaptation to decrease our sensitivity to a constant level of stimulation. Otherwise, we would feel the weight of our clothes all day long, and it would probably drive us to distraction. Vision is perhaps the most studied of our sensory systems, perhaps because we use it so often. The process begins when light waves pass through the cornea, the outside layer of the eyeball. This cornea does most of the focusing of the light. It's also very sensitive to touch, as you've probably noticed if you've ever scratched your cornea. The light then goes through the pupil, which is a dark opening in the center of the iris. The iris is the color of your eyes on your driver's license. Behind the iris is the lens. The lens makes the image sharper and more focused and refines it before it passes through the eye into the back of the eye where the retina is. As you can see here, the light travels to the back of the eye and strikes specialized receptor cells called rods and cones, which transduce the light energy into neural impulses. Transduction is the process by which a physical stimulus is translated into a neural impulse, an action potential. The rods and cones then connect to bipolar cells, which connect to ganglion cells, and the ganglion cells all leave the back of the eye as the optic nerve for each eye. The point where the optic nerve leaves the eye is called the blind spot, as we have no rods or cones there. Rods are the sensory receptors that detect low-level light waves. They are located mostly in the periphery of the retina, and they do not detect color, nor do they provide the sharpest image. Cones are located mostly towards the center of the retina, otherwise known as the fovea, and cones provide a much sharper picture, and they respond to colors. Unfortunately, they require more light, brighter light that is, in order to function. After the axons of the optic nerves leave through the blind spot, they reach the optic chiasm near the hypothalamus. At this point, the nerves split in half. Half goes to the same side of the brain and half goes to the other side of the brain. The optic nerves then continue on until they reach the primary visual cortex, which is at the very back of the occipital lobe, in the back of your head. Light travels in waves, and certain features of those waves determine the experience that we have of color. Humans can detect light waves between 400 and 700 nanometers, or billionths of a meter. The wavelength of the light is the distance between two peaks. And this is what we detect as a particular color. The height of the wave, or the amplitude, is what we detect as brightness. As you can see from this chart, we can only see a small part of the electromagnetic spectrum. The shorter the wavelengths, the more energy is contained within them. For example, just shorter than the visible spectrum is ultraviolet radiation. Ultraviolet A, which runs from 320 to 400 nanometers, is what produces tans and causes the skin to produce vitamin D. Ultraviolet B, which is from 280 to 320 nanometers, is what causes skin damage and potentially skin cancers. Ultraviolet C, which is from 10 to 280 nanometers, is mostly blocked out by the ozone layers. X-rays, which are even shorter wavelengths, can pull electrons out of atoms, thus breaking chemical bonds, and can destroy molecules such as DNA. The shortest wavelengths are gamma rays, which are produced by the accelerating protons in nuclei of stars. These are mostly blocked out by the atmosphere, where they would cause intense damage to us. Hue is the distinctive characteristics of a particular color that we detect. There are basically two theories that together explain color vision. The trichromatic theory holds that there are three different types of cone receptor cells that respond differentially to different parts of the wavelength spectrum. And in fact, we do have three types of cones. As you can see, some respond to the shortest wavelengths, some to medium wavelengths, and some to longer wavelengths. It is the combination of responses of these three types of cones that determines the particular visual color that we see. The opponent process theory works at the level of the ganglion cells, which are in pairs. Each pair responds to a set of opposite wavelengths. That is, there are red-green, blue-yellow, and light-dark pairs. As one member of a pair becomes overly excited and gets tired, so to speak, it loses its ability to detect color, and we have a negative afterimage of the opposite color in that pair. This can be demonstrated with the slide in front of you. If you stare at the black dot in the center of the flag for approximately 60 seconds, and then suddenly shift your gaze to the right to the black dot in the center of that rectangle, you should see the American flag with its proper colors due to the opponent process of the ganglion cells. If you've heard the saying, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, that comes from the Gestalt psychologist who determined that individuals see a whole figure that arises from the characteristics of the parts, but in fact contains more information than those parts, depending on how we organize it. For example, looking at the figure to the right, you may see either a young woman or an old woman or both Don't worry if you can't see one of them. That's totally normal. This slide shows some other ways in which we organize the visual world to fill in information that the brain assumes should be there. One of the most important visual perceptual features is depth perception. Because we have two eyes, we have the binocular depth cue of retinal disparity, or the difference in the images on the two retinas. We also receive some depth perception information from monocular cues, or those that only rely on one eye. These include the ones shown in the figure here. Sound perception is also important in our everyday life, and it occurs through the following process. Sound waves enter through the auditory canal, strike the eardrum, causing it to vibrate. This vibration sets up a series of vibration in the three small bones in the middle ear, colloquially known as the hammer, anvil, and stirrup. The last of these causes vibration on the oval window, which is the opening to the cochlea. The cochlea is the structure in the inner ear that contains the sensory receptors for sound. Tiny cells known as hair cells, which are not actually hairs, are along the base of the cochlea on the basilar membrane, which is the membrane on the base of the cochlea. The vibrations of these hair cells are transduced into neural images that are collected and become the auditory nerve for each ear. The auditory nerve runs to the thalamus and then to the primary auditory cortex in the temporal lobe. Some information from each auditory nerve goes to the same side, but mostly it goes to the opposite side of the brain. As with light waves, sound waves also have amplitude and wavelength. The amplitude, or the height of the sound waves, is what we perceive as loudness, and the frequency or wavelength is what we perceive as pitch. Our interpretation of pitch is somewhat complex. Both the place along the basilar membrane that the hair cell vibrates and the speed at which it vibrates determine our perception of pitch. These two processes are called place coding and temporal coding, respectively. Taste involves specialized receptors on the tongue and throat called taste buds. The taste buds are contained in the papillae, which are those little bumps that you see on the surface of your tongue. Molecules in the food and drink that we ingest stimulate these taste buds, and the information goes through the thalamus and to the gustatory cortex, which is in the frontal lobe of the brain. Smell is a particularly powerful sense. The reason for this is that there are odor detectors on the surface of the nasal epithelium, the inside of your nose, that respond to chemicals in the air and detect smells. This information does not go to the thalamus directly, unlike all the other senses. So it goes to the olfactory bulb and then directly to the cortex to be interpreted. The projections from the olfactory bulb also go to the limbic system, which is why smells sometimes evoke very powerful emotional memories for us. Our skin and viscera allow us to detect temperature, pressure, movement, and pain. We actually have separate receptors for detecting warmth and for detecting cold. Pain is not everybody's favorite subject, but it's important to understand because pain gives us cues to dangers in the environment. We have two basic types of pain fibers. Fast fibers carry information directly to the brain very quickly because they're myelinated. And when we perceive a sharp, immediate pain, it's the fast fibers that are carrying that information. Slow fibers are unmyelinated and detect chronic, dull pain. This takes longer to get to the brain. The information from both of these types of fibers travels to the thalamus and then to a couple of different areas in the brain. The somatosensory cortex detects where the pain is. Other areas, including the periaqueductal gray and the anterior cingulate cortex, determine how painful something is, that is, the emotional component. I hope this lecture hasn't been too painful for you, and I look forward to seeing you next week.